National Institute of Standards and Technology, and he manages the Wildland Urban Interface Fire Group within NIST, which is super important to us. And I think he's overseen hundreds of large-scale experiments. We can let him tell us a little bit about his history. So most of the experiments, I think, are related to ignitions, and he's done a lot of post-fire reconstruction. So he's very experienced, and we're very lucky to have him here today. So Alexander, I think with that, I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Denise. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here. I want to acknowledge my co-author, Eric Link, who's also on the line here with us today. If I lose the internet or power, Eric will continue with the presentation. So as Denise said, we work for NIST. We're part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, a non-regulatory agency. We generate a product based on science, and we make that available to the public to help with national issues. In specific, our fourth reconstruction of significant WUI events, and we're going to be talking about that today, about the Camp Fire. At the same time, we are conducting different types of small, intermediate, and large-scale fire experiments on campus and with our partners, based on the lessons learned from our field reconstructions. So in the field, we identify vulnerabilities, we bring that knowledge back to the lab, we confirm them, we come up with mitigation strategies, we make that information available to the public. And at the very end of this presentation, the last slide is going to be on our ongoing structure separation experiments, multi-year effort. As a little teaser, we'll come back with you after the new year when we issue our first report. There's going to be multiple reports over the next 3 years on this issue. So this is not going to be a one-time deal. So I'm going to get going. Thank you again for the invitation. And let's talk about the Camp Fire. So this is a multi-year reconstruction for us. We're about halfway through the effort. We released in February the report we're going to be talking about today. We're working actively on the next report, which should come out next late spring. And then we have one more after that. All these people that you see on the cover page here helped with collecting data in the field. So a big thank you. And a big thank you to all 192 contributors who made this report possible. So to give you a sense of scale, what we're going to be presenting today to you involved over 10,000 hours of work, a big undertaking, and this effort is ongoing. So big thank you to all of our federal, state, and local partners. We could not have done this without you. So a couple of things I want to point out here as we move through the presentation. We have a bar on the left side of the screen to help navigate as we go through the presentation, so you can follow along where we are, and then that'll be easy to keep track. And then on this part down here on the lower left, throughout the presentation, you will see references to figures and tables in the report. So if you see a table here on the lower left, on that same page, you will know what the table number it is in the report, so you can easily go back and find that and learn more if you're interested. The first case study were interface communities, and while there's still a lot to learn in the interface, we felt we needed to get going in the intermix community, and we're very happy we did so because we learned some very critical lessons here, as you'll see. Rapid fire spread to and within Paradise that had significant impacts on life safety, response, and losses. We're going to go through that. The third theme to keep in mind, you're going to see it woven throughout the presentation, is the issue of burnovers. Large number of documented versus reported burnovers. They occurred in town and on major arteries and had significant impact on life safety, both of first responders and civilians. Lastly, based on all the work we have done to date, we feel unfortunately very confident that this was not a unique event. And we set forth to try and answer the question, or at least have a path forward to answer the question of how many other communities are in a similar situation to Paradise. So why did we do the campfire? We didn't do the campfire only because it was large. We have a lot of technical requirements, and this fire met them. We need very data-rich scene in order to be able to stitch in time and space all the events and reconstruct the fire. We needed to have a really good handshake with the locals, which we had. In this case with CAL FIRE, that enabled us very rapid deployment and integration into the instant command system, and access to the fire scene before the residents were in. And in this case, we had a good intermixed community, good in the sense that the entire town was impacted and evacuated. That was a really nice data set for us. The size and losses were obviously of interest, but not the driver. Extreme fire behavior was. So all of these attributes came together, and we decided to go and do a reconnaissance, have an initial handshake with CAL FIRE, come back to NIST, brief our management and leadership, go back out, and then get the ball rolling. You are all familiar with the area up there, but for our East Coast audience, we put here that the area represents about 4 times the size of Washington D.C. for reference. All right, some overview and statistics. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because a lot of you sure know a lot of this. A couple of things to point out: over 50,000 people displaced, 85 fatalities, unfortunately, which set a new threshold. And then over 3,200 people had to be located after the fire, which was and we've been to many fires, but this was really eye-opening, not only because of the scale, but because of the relative amount of destruction.
Alex, excuse me, Alex, you were, unfortunately, the connection went poor when you started this slide. Would you be able to do a quick summary?
Sure. Yes.
I don't think it came through.
Thank you. So over 50,000 people were displaced. Almost 20,000 structures were damaged and destroyed. So a new threshold was breached there, and the same with the fatalities, unfortunately. We also put here persons located because that was a very significant amount of, that was a significant effort that went into tracking all those people so that it could be linked with the fatalities and missing persons and all of that. The last point I was making here is that the devastation was not only extensive in absolute terms, but also in relative terms, because most of the town was wiped out, unfortunately. So for those of you who have not been there, we put this map in the presentation to give you a sense of location, and we're going to give you some names here to remember through the presentation. So the fire started here in Polgam. We're going to be talking about Concow. This is a settlement of under 1,000 people that was impacted first before the fire did the run from ignition, the 7 miles to the edge of Paradise and hit this community. The community, in general terms, is on this relatively flat area. You'll see the topography. You can see it clearly all around, canyons, some lined with prevailing winds. Things to remember here is we have Pence. That's the road, the main artery here that is used for egress, goes down the hill. Then we have Clark Road, Neal Road, and Skyway. And Skyway goes all the way through town and up through Magalia and out. So how all this played out. The evacuation information in context of notifications, evacuation traffic, temporary refuge areas, and safety zones will all be covered in the next report, which we'll share with you next year. So let's look at losses. A couple of things to point out. As I mentioned here, 90% of all structures were damaged or destroyed. So that is really a big hit for our community. Almost 14,000 single residences, almost 20,000 total. But the one other number I want you to look at here is we had over 500 commercial buildings. So this is not an insignificant number, and we're going to need to look at that as we go forward and understand what really happened there. Are there weaknesses that we need to address? Our primary focus for the past 15 plus years in the WUI has been on residences, because that has been where the losses have primarily occurred. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to be looking at commercial as well as we go forward. I mentioned 5 reports. So today we're going to be talking about report number 3. These 1 and 2 and 3 are out available, and 4 is coming next year, and 5 the year after that. And that's going to complete our full case study. We are planning on putting together a data visualization tool with all this information at the end of this study. So I'm going to keep this on the screen for a few seconds, and you can use your phone if you want to grab that QR code, and that'll take you straight to the site down.
Alex, can you hear me okay?
We're going to discuss 2135. This is a 400-page report. Yes.
So Alex, the connection, like, you start off fine when you start a slide and then it cuts down. Maybe you could turn off your video.
Okay, stop.
And then continue.
Let me turn off my video and see how that works.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so
Hi,
we're going to
David.
be talking about technical note 2135 today. And let's talk now about the 5 research questions that we set forth to address. So the first question was really a science question, but it's really a logistical issue and a methodology issue. How can we tackle such an event? Luckily, we have data collection, analysis, integration, and documentation methodology that is very expandable, very flexible, which we developed all the way back at the Witchfire. And this has enabled us to tackle such an event on the scale of the campfire. All of this information on the data collection, analysis, integration is in the report, but in the interest of time, I will not be covering it in this presentation. Second question, how did the fire spread to and within Paradise? We're going to talk about that. What were the primary causes of extensive devastation? Fire pathways that cause structural ignitions. We have some nice crisp data of how fire on the parcel migrated and got to the house and burned different structures down. And then lastly, how unique was Paradise? So let's get going with pre-fire conditions. We're going to talk about wind, drought, topography, and fire history. Not new to most of you, unfortunately. This is not an uncommon situation in California, but the majority of the area of interest here was in very high fire hazard severity zones. And that holds not only for Magalia and the area between parts of Concow, but also just about the entirety of Paradise. So we knew that that was a problem. Cal Fire knew that was a problem. The locals knew that that was a problem. Topography. In this case, it really didn't help us. As I mentioned earlier, this is Paradise, and in this little bowl is Concow, and Magalia is up here. The color is a gentle slope, typical for construction, up to 15%. The next color is moderate, and that's the limit goes up to 30%, which is about the limit for hiking, and then it gets very steep. And as you can see from this here, many of you are familiar with this area. There's some very steep canyons. Some of them with quasi-vertical walls. A lot of them aligned with the prevailing winds. And the other thing I want to point out here is these canyons really challenge response and evacuation as well, as we'll see later on. Red flag warnings and drought. Again, all these things are adding, compounding the issues that developed that day. The wind forecasts were right on, and we saw gusts in excess of 50 miles an hour at the forecasted locations. So that developed as we expected, unfortunately, and all that was compounded by 200 days nominally without precipitation. Lastly, fire history here didn't help us at all. And I want to focus here on the upper figure, and that is in the report figure 10. And what we see here is the last 100+ years of fire history in Butte County. And you see that this community, Paradise, and large parts of Magalia, which were developed in the forest, had not burned for over a century. And on the lower graph, on the lower figure, you can see number of years since the last fire. So this was an area with very significant fuel loading, plus diseased vegetation on top of it all. This confluence of factors really resulted in the fire behavior we're going to be talking about here shortly. Before we get into the community preparedness, and then after that into fire progression, I want to talk briefly about housing density in Paradise. And the reason I want to do that is because I want to highlight to you that on those events, when we're talking about large complex events, it's very difficult to paint the entire event with one brush, with one broad brush, because locally conditions can vary very significantly. We know that exposures can vary on a sub-parcel scale, and this really, I think, helps illustrate this. So I want to walk through these 4 areas here, and these are all in Paradise. So on the upper left, we have Apple Tree Village. That's a mobile home park. You can see the density. In many cases, structure separation were well less than 10 feet, in some cases 3 feet. Very, very tightly packed, and in many cases, readily ignitable construction in the exposures that were received. On the upper right, that's a cul-de-sac, Lancaster Drive of Billy Road. Here we have a 10-foot structural separation, and that translates to about double the structure. So here we go, 7 structures per acre on the mobile home park, down to just under 3. And I want to here just make a quick side note, very briefly. We'll pick this up at the very end of the presentation again, but this 10-foot separation, we did our first structural separation experiment at NIST about a dozen years ago, where we looked at 2 facades 6 feet apart. And without going into all the details, a room fire in one structure caused the adjacent structure to ignite in 80 seconds, 6 feet away. And this has led over time, together with all of our other findings, to our ongoing structure separation experimental series, which I'll describe briefly at the end of the presentation. So here, the reason I brought this up is because on the upper 2 blocks here, flames will touch from building to building in many situations, if not all. On the lower left, Valley Ridge. This is frequently a community, a neighborhood in Paradise that is highlighted as a Chapter 7A success story. And I'm the first to admit that Chapter 7A adds tremendous value, but the reason I'm bringing this up here is to point out that you really cannot compare this community to this community. These lots are significantly larger. The structural separations now are up to 26 feet, 1.4 structures per acre. We have swimming pools, manicured lawns, large non-combustible driveways, and it's quite a different setting. Significantly lower fuel densities in terms of vegetative fuels, a much newer community. The fire impacted parts of that significantly later in the event. More mutual aid was there. So very, very different. But in the context of what we're talking about right here, this is not, even though this is the same event, we don't want to be comparing apples and oranges here. Lastly, around Valley Ranch, this is a case where your house, if it catches on fire, the flames from your house are not going to have any impact on the neighboring structures. Fire may propagate through other pathways, but not through direct flame contact and radiation. So let's talk about preparedness. And I think here the message is that Paradise was very well prepared. All right, and that is great news because their preparations really had significant impact, particularly on life safety. But even with those preparations, we saw what happened. So this is really a big cautionary tale for other communities, particularly mixed communities. So Paradise has had multiple programs in place to increase awareness, reduce fuels. They had designated special days every month where you could bring vegetative refuge to the dump and not pay any money. You could remove trees up to, you could remove vegetation up to 9 inches in diameter without any permits. There were all sorts of opportunities for people to learn, get engaged, take action. What we did hear directly from the town council there is that people wanted that live in the forest feel, and that's why a lot of people moved to Paradise. And that is something that I think is going to be very important to address as we go forward. The second point I want to make is Town of Paradise had an emergency notification and an evacuation. We're going to rehearsed the evacuation plan, which is really quite special. Public Works was well prepared. They had received training on how to respond to fires in a number of areas that were emergency fire shelters for Public Works staff, and infrastructure was specifically addressed in their pre-fire preparation. So let's talk a little bit about that. Communications. They knew that it was a red flag, that a red flag warning was event was on its way. So they went and replaced all the battery backups to their communication system, and that enabled them to keep those lines of communication going throughout the event. Paradise Irrigation District.
This is Chloe. How may I help you?
Hi, Chloe.
Water systems were all topped off. All the reservoirs were at full capacity. And as we'll see later in the presentation, PID had also had a fuel treatment around its critical pump station. And firefighting staffing was at increased level locally and regionally. And we'll be talking about that in report 5. And that's obviously a huge plus for CAL FIRE and all the mutual aids in the area. So summary conditions, summary for pre-fire. I want to focus here on the right side. The bottom line is prepare, prepare, prepare. These events deploy very rapidly, occur very rapidly. Minutes matter. You want to have plans. You want to have rehearsed them. Obviously, frequently plans will need to change, but having plans in place adds tremendous value. Know your community, fire history, fuel loadings, local conditions, severe weather events, all of that. Critical infrastructure, fuel treatments, they worked in the case of Paradise. We'll show you. Obviously, plan for continuity of government. And think about what's going to happen when you lose power. Because we will lose power either intentionally before the wind event or because of the fire. So we're going to lose power, and more than likely, in many cases, we're going to also lose water. So these are messages, take-home messages from this section. So let's talk about fire progression. In this section, I want to cover the Incident Commander overview, talk about how we've packaged the fire progression information in the report, look at some analysis, and then look at some animations in our maps that we have for you. So table 10 in the report is the Incident Commander technical discussion, a narrative literally minute by minute from the Incident Commander. And that is really an eye-opening narration. I really encourage you to take a look at this, study this, because it shows you how quickly things develop. It gives you a really good sense of their situational awareness, how well they did in responding, how effective they were in responding, and then take all of that knowledge and tie it together with the loss information and see why in many cases we're very, very fortunate here because of the pre-planning and the effectiveness of the defensive actions. So fire progression, there is a lot here to cover. This is a very complex event geospatially. So what we've done is we've given you three options. Option one is you can go and read the overview in the executive summary. That's 3 pages. And I definitely encourage you to do that, but I would prefer if you don't stop there. I think you'll get a lot of value if you go to the detailed fire behavior section in the report, which is 71 pages. And that describes fire progression by region and by time. And also the report is accompanied by 14 large format maps. Those are E-size maps, 3 feet by 4 feet. And those are time slices that look at the entire event. And if you want, Denise, you can let me know, and I can send to the Fire Council one hard copy of the report with maps that you can then circulate within the group. Lastly, all of the data, all of 2,000 plus data points for fire can be found in Appendix F along with their source. That's 113 pages of 8 fonts. So all the information for the fire progression, all the data with their source in terms of what technical discussion they came from is all available, and it's all included in this report. So in the detailed narration, we have set this up in 15 regions. We have tried to essentially lay out the regions chronologically. So we start with CONCOW, and the fire progresses in this general direction. So in each section, we have a narrative summary of what happened in that region. We describe in a tabulated form highlights of the events, with time description, general location, and where the sources came from, whether it came from a 911 call or a technical discussion or a picture, and so on and so forth. So I want to, we're not going to go through, obviously, all those regions. The report is over 400 pages long. I just want to spend a couple of minutes here showing you what the tables look like. So we're just going to look at CONCOW here very briefly, and then I'll move on to the summary. So this is a snapshot from table 11 in the report. And what we're seeing here is the first 911 calls started coming in at 6:25. So between 6:25 and 6:40, we had 3 911 calls. This is the location that was reported, and this is the first reported information on the fire. 6:45, so very rapid deployment of resources. First engine gets sight of the well-established fire. Wind is already blowing at 35 miles an hour sustained. And already at this time at 6:45, the captain of the first engine on the scene declares the potential for a major incident. So they're on top of it. They already know that access is going to be an issue, wind is going to be an issue, and they're already taking actions with that context in mind. And at 7:15, just a highlight, the fire spreads from the origin and gets established in the Flea Valley above Pulga. So let's now take a snapshot here. This is a composite from a video, and that's taken at 7:23. So you can see the complexity of the terrain. For scale on the lower part here, here 7:20. The march is a little finicky. 7:20 to 7:30. Now we have engines attempting to access the north flank. And then we have spot fires on Rim Road, and we have an engine on Rim Road. And I'm going to now play you a video from Rim Road. The multiple fires all around, spots across the viewing here from the hilltop all the way. Let me play this one more time. The winds are so severe that
Alex, you're cutting out during the video. I think it's too much bandwidth. So maybe you can give a recap after we watch the video.
Of one of the maps. These are e-size, so these are large format maps, 3 feet by 4 feet. And there are 14 of them that accompany the report, and there are time slices that can let you look at what's going on across the entire incident in a specific time window. So if we zoom in here, that's the type of information we have for you in those maps. We have Bs for burnovers. Different symbols represent different types of fire, whether it's a spot fire, a veg fire, a structure fire. And then we have summary statements of key events that are occurring in this time window, along with arrows showing the general fire progression. And in this case, the arrows are all pointing east to west, but as you'll see shortly, that's not going to be the case throughout the whole incident. So what we have done is, in order to convey to you the fire progression, we have taken a number of time slices between ignition and 10:45, and we're going to show you in short animations the progression with some bubbles that are going to pop up, some text notes that are going to pop up, and then at the end of this, we're going to do a full animation for the first 24 hours. So let's get started with this one. So we see ignition shortly before 6:30. The fire progresses into Concau. Yes, we have initial spots off Pence Road. So this is the eastern part of Paradise. So we see rapid fire growth, and you will see in the next time window here how the fire intensity and activity really picks up in Concau and also in Paradise. And we see fire reaching way into the community, actually all the way across the community, including spot fires igniting off Dunley Road here. And you can see the number of ignitions, which we're going to cover in a separate slide here shortly. So let's do the next time slice, but you can already see that we are now nominally 2 hours after ignition, and the fire is well established all across Paradise. Next time window, you can see now we have a spot fire igniting all the way on Honey Run, many miles from the ignition and many miles from the eastern edge of Paradise. And what we're seeing in this time window is that the fire now is starting seeing here, which is going to eventually grow and cause a problem here. We're seeing fires off Skyway. At the same time, Pence Road is starting to really become problematic, and the activity in Concau hasn't stopped. The fire is continuing to burn in Concau with significant intensity. And let's look at our last time window here, which takes us to 10:45. And the yellow is the perimeter of the satellite imagery, which we're going to overlay here in a second. But what we see here now is we're starting to see burnovers here. Burnovers on Pence, burnovers on Clark, burnovers on Skyway. And this is really one of the big findings and one of the issues of concerns to us, specifically with those intermixed communities, that the combination of the factors that we talked about earlier, including and specifically fire history or lack of fire history, can result in extensive growth near primary arteries, which can then significantly choke evacuation. And this is the satellite imagery. All right, so what we have here for you is the first 24 hours. So I'm going to play this a couple of times, and what I want you to look at is two things. First, how in some areas the fire stops and then after a while starts again, and then the same thing happens over here, and eventually it makes it down the hill with some activity overnight, particularly up here in Magalia in the Kudlik area, and on the flanks here in Konkal. All right, so fire progression. Implementation thoughts to consider. Consider extreme fire behavior when establishing trigger points for evacuation. This is absolutely essential. And when you read the incident commander report, the table, the summary table, you will really get a sense about how quickly this developed. And this is while accounting for the truly amazing response by CAL FIRE and in the mutual aid that was present. So consider the spotting potential of local fuels and how are the far field spotting, how far field spotting can impact your egress routes. That's going to be really important. We're going to talk about egress routes more in report number 4. Also, I want to point out another message here that I think is very important. Identify high hazard locations and installations and make sure that you can readily communicate that to mutual aid, because this is an issue that we definitely identified. And there is a path forward to address this issue near the end of the presentation. We're going to talk about that. So let's hone in. I kind of gave you a little bit on burnovers, but let's really dive in. 19 documented burnovers, and in the process of doing our campfire report number 4, we have identified burnover number 20, which is going to be included in that report. Out of the 19 reported documented burnovers in this report, 11 incidents occurred nominally in the first 2 hours between 8 and 10 in the morning. So, and that's why here a lot of them impacted the evacuation. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by burnovers. We're not using the explicit NWCG definition. We have tied and merged burnovers, entrapments, and near misses because we have the spatial resolution to see the transition of some of those events and the evolution. But in general terms, we're talking about events that resulted in life-threatening situations where fire overtook personnel and typically equipment, and escape routes or safety zones were absent, inadequate, or compromised. And in many cases, temporary refuge areas had to be established for life safety. So these are significant events, and you'll see here what we're talking about. So we have 19 events. The first one occurred in Konkal. The second one in Konkal, they're all numbered. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we're going to look at some of them in the next few slides. A couple of things to point out. We have 11, as I mentioned, before 10 o'clock. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 of them we deemed as high risk for injury and death. Those were very, very dangerous situations. It's not that the events labeled number 2 were insignificant in terms of life safety, but number 1s were really extreme events, and you'll see some of them here in the next few slides. But what I also want to mention here in this slide is that these events did not all occur in the first 2 hours. We see burnovers occurring 24 hours after the ignition, and those had impact on life safety of first responders. So this is, again, not something that we only want to think about in the context of evacuation. This is very, very important. So In order to pull this information together for you, we have all this burnover details in Appendix B. So for each burnover, in this case, Hoffman Road, we give you a general description of the event, location, all of the data associated with the event, topography, road access, vegetative setback, duration of the event, all these details, along with two maps, one that shows general area of the burnover with the roads, another one that shows pre-fire conditions, and Google Street View link. We cannot put the Street View images in the report, so we give you a link that you can go and look at Street View and toggle in history and see when it's available, what the conditions looked like when the Street View documented that location last before the fire. So a plethora of information here. So let's look at the first burnover number 1, and that happened on Hoffman Road. So this is Bing imagery pre-fire. A lot of vegetation here. This is a low water crossing. Concow Lake is on the left here. There's a creek right here. The fire developed very rapidly as a convoy of civilians led by a first responder vehicle was heading out. The conditions deteriorated very rapidly. Vegetation structures burned. The end of the convoy started catching fire. Fire shelters were actually deployed to escort civilians from their vehicles that caught on fire and seek shelter in the creek. So a very dramatic event. Dozer eventually was able to clear access and get those people moved from this location. But the event did not end there, and all those details are being described in our next report. I'm going to talk briefly about burnover number 4. So we're giving you, the intent here is to give you a sense of how these things occurred through town and to help you think about any potential similar situations that you may have in your jurisdiction or community. A lot of you may have seen the pictures of the burned bus on Skyway. So this is from one of the strike teams that was that drove through under very severe conditions. They had to wait until it was passable, and even then it was very severe. Running the gauntlet was the term used by many of them. The challenge here was that we had a very long stretch of a primary artery that had multiple ignitions, multiple spots, and it continued burning for a very long time, pinching that artery and restricting egress from points north, but also at the same time preventing easy access to first responders. This area had to be cleared up with a dozer later in the day to really facilitate access and evacuation as part of a convoy that went to rescue people from TRAs, which we're going to talk about again in report 4. And lastly, I want us to talk about Penns Road, because here we have 3 events in close proximity to each other. And the reason we picked those 3 to illustrate here is that here also across the community and go down from the north. So let's look at number 6. We will see some flashing there, some flashing lights. These were the conditions, literally zero visibility, still traffic. The first responder here, truly heroic actions, saved tens of civilians, probably close to 100 civilians. Turned them around, got them to shelter, and
Alex, it's cutting out when you're speaking and the video is running at the same time. Maybe we could view the video and then you could speak.
quite the challenging conditions. Let's move on to number 7, Pearson Road. Some of you may have seen some of this. I think it was featured on 60 Minutes, if I remember correctly. So these are pictures from the engine, and you see the glowing. The conditions were essentially similar to that in a furnace. Everything was on fire, vehicles on fire, structures on fire, vegetation on fire. The engine sustained significant damage. The engine ended up sheltering civilians whose vehicles were compromised, and fire shelters had to be deployed in the engine to shield the radiation, from the outside. The engines had significant damage and had to go offline for part of the incident. Lastly, we're going to talk about the burnover on Billy Road, and this is also a very interesting burnover for a number of reasons. Large intersection, 2 main arteries, cross artery Billy and north-south Pence Road, gridlocked with vehicles. Luckily, a fire engine was able to make it to that intersection, coming up on Pence against traffic and zero visibility, hooked up to a hydrant and sprayed a large number of vehicles with a monitor. The ones that you see here burned could not be reached by the engine. This engine saved a lot of people, not only civilians, but also first responders. Very dangerous, very hazardous conditions. This area, this intersection, this part of Billy remained closed for the entire day. It took a lot of work to clear all this up and make this road passable the next day. So major intersection completely offline for the entire event. So life safety, definitely a big issue with all these events. This is not something insignificant. This is very, very important. We really need to think about this, particularly for intermix communities as we go forward. And that's one of the reasons we really wanted to do an intermix, to make sure we weren't missing something big, and the burnovers are it. So we're very happy that we had the ability to track all of this down and document it, and that's going to lead to research and guidance for vegetative setbacks, for arteries and safety zones going forward. We have a video here to show you to give you a sense of some of the conditions. Really,
Hey, Alex, excuse me. Alex, this is Eric.
These 2 images, these are...
Your bandwidth is really struggling when you speak and the videos play at the same time.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you, Eric. This is the last video. We don't have any more videos. So let me go through this again. Thank you, Eric. So very severe conditions, both in terms of fire and ember exposures from different fuels, buildings, as you see, vehicles, vegetation, and other combustibles, including fences on multiple pictures. On the lower right, you see 2 images taken 4 minutes apart, only a quarter mile apart, and you see the conditions deteriorating from zero visibility to passable over this very short distance. And we saw this over and over throughout the event. Conditions varied very locally. So a burnover summary, consider possible burnover locations in and outside of town. And I want to stress outside, because as you will see, we can be in a situation where things are clean in town, but one of the main arteries further down, or where arteries merge way out of town, can gridlock, and then that gridlock can work its way all the way back into town. Consider fuel treatments to reduce potential burnovers. This is an issue particularly that's challenging to potentially implement because of the of who owns those hazards. But definitely something that I think is going to require a lot of discussion as we go forward. Safety zones in and out of town in context of extreme fire behavior and burnovers. This is going to be really the discussion we want to start with our next report. Fuel ownership in assessing and mitigating potential burnovers is going to be, I think, a real challenge. But we need to start those discussions. General fire behavior, effects of wind and terrain, spot fires, structure ignition pathways. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on wind and terrain, but I do want to cover spot fires and structure ignition pathways. So we talked about Rim Road. What I want to point out here is that we did see strong winds, not everywhere, but we did see locally strong winds and over specific time periods. Terrain had the direct impact, of course, on fire, and locally we saw some extreme flame lengths ranging from 100 to 200 feet, associated primarily with those steep canyons. But this is really what I want to talk about here. I want to focus on early spot fires in Paradise. These are all confirmed documented ignitions in Paradise. This does not mean that we have all of them, but this is the minimum that we absolutely know and we can track. So we split them into two colors for you. Red, we have 30 of them, and those occurred between 7:49 and 8:30. The import of that is the fire front didn't hit the edge of the community right here until 8:30. So all these red dots came from the fire from the east, mostly in vegetative fuel, but also from a few structures that had ignited and burned by that time in Concao. But the vast majority of the fuel was wildland fuel. And what I want to show here is that these are not spots that were focused in the first quarter or half mile. 29 out of those 30 spots occurred in the first 2.5 miles from the edge of the community. So that front really had quite a reach into the community. And with the fuel ignition potential that we're going to talk about and the amount of fuel, this became untenable in the context of response. It was just raining embers, multiple ignitions, very rapid development. But that's not it. We also know that between 8:30 and 10:30, we have another 35 spots. And some of them went well in past 5 miles. In one case, one went past 5 miles, which is the one that closed the artery over here that we talked about earlier. And those, the reason they're black is because they could have initiated within Paradise. We don't know that. But you see how rapidly things developed in the first 40 minutes. So it's almost a spot a minute. And that gives you a sense of how challenging the response was, even if engines could get on location. So we're going to talk about switch gear here and talk about structure ignition pathways. And I want to spend here a minute talking about the relationship between structure survivability, hardening of the structure, and exposure. And the way we think about this is we have distilled it to these two knobs. On the left, we have the exposure, and on the right, we have the structure hardening. So I'm going to go through a couple of extremes. So you can take the red knob, the exposure, and turn it all the way to 0 on the left, going minus to the minus. And then you don't have to worry about hardening, because if there is no fire and there's no embers, you don't have an issue. But that's not obviously a realistic situation. Chapter 49, defensible space, and Chapter 7A, Subcommittee 6 are all looking at ways to quantify and reduce exposure. So we have a knob, we have the ability through some of the tools that we already have in place, including your local jurisdiction ordinances, to do some control over that exposure. So the idea here is we want to make sure that wherever we set that exposure knob, the hardening is commensurate and we end up in the no ignition regime in the structure. Because what we have seen is if the structure ignites and is not defended, it's going to go. All of the 95+% of damaged structures in the case studies that we have done over the last 15 years, 95% of the time we can tell you the name of the first responder that saved that damaged structure. So if it's damaged, it's defended. So the goal is not to get it ignited. So, the balance is hardening and reducing the exposure. And that's what we're trying to do. And there is no one size fits all. It depends on the type of community, the fuel density, the environment, whether it is interface, intermix, and so on and so forth. But that's, in general terms, how it plays out. Those two tools, that's what we have to work with. So we're going to talk about structure ignition pathways. Here we have this figure, which is figure 54 in the report. We have our primary residence that we want to protect. These are some examples of the vulnerabilities. These are not all by any stretch of the imagination. And then in the WUI environment, we have a number of fuels, or potentially a number of fuels. So some can be attached combustibles like decks, pergolas, awnings. Some can be detached combustibles, fences, wood piles, etc. And this detached may belong to you or may belong to your neighbor. Same thing with ornamental vegetation. And then we have, of course, sheds, other secondary structures, again, barns, carports, and the like that can belong to either you or your neighbor, and the other residences. And lastly, we have the wildland vegetation. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to look at some pictures, some different failure points. Again, these are not all inclusive, but just to highlight what we're talking about. Windows, single pane, double pane, tempered, not tempered, different frames. These are defended structure with a lot of window damage. Roofs and eaves, most of it, all of you know all about these types of issues, construction, particularly the vents, gables, and so on. And this is an example. This is a case where the exposure came from an aluminum john boat. Here, we do not know the contents of the boat. We do know that it was resting on some large 4x4 timbers. And this exposure from here to the stucco wall, which held very nicely, resulted in multiple ignitions in the roof and eaves. And the structure was defended and saved. So we want to give you a few examples here in the next few slides from Campfire to show the structure ignition pathways. And the reason we're doing this is to show you how fire can progress and how we need to think about uncoupling those pathways to make sure we increase the ignition resistance of the structures. So in example 1, we have a situation where a fence ignites, and that fence ignites ornamental vegetation, which then ignites the eaves and roof of the structure, and the structure is destroyed. A couple of things to point out in this scenario. This is a combustible fence here, which does not belong to the residence that burned. This structure on the perimeter of it, nominally 6 feet away, is a chain link fence. So we, these owners chose to have a non-combustible fence. In this case, we have a combustible fence, probably with some fuels down here that, it can be pine needles pushed over by the wind, even if things were clean before the fire. We have an ignition, possibly from an ember. The fence and the fuels get going, rapidly transition to the tree. You see the embers being generated here by this rapid progression. And in 139 seconds, so in less than 2.5 minutes, we have the home going and subsequent destruction. These pictures were taken we're very fortunate to have these two pictures. The water had completely failed. There wasn't any water available to take care of this event. So we have these pictures, and those are very, very important for us. Next scenario we're going to talk about is vehicles, and we're going to be looking at vehicles and the hazard that they bring to the buoy in the context of the spacing from primary residence and other fuels in a couple of years. So this is a case of vehicle to siding. And in this case, the structure was saved, and it was saved by defensive actions. This is us collecting the field in the data, collecting the data in the field. And we hypothesized that based on the information on the scene, that a vehicle had been in this location and displaced because of the debris pile behind it, and that vehicle had been responsible for the damage. Fast forward to technical discussion 91. And we identified and spoke with the dozer operator who got on the scene, found the vehicle on fire, causing the structure ignition, displaced the vehicle, and opened up and saved the structure. Incidentally, I want to mention that this structure may be in some reports and analyzed in the context of structure survivability, but this structure was defended. Lastly, we're going to talk about a complex event, and this is a very interesting event for a number of reasons. This shows propagation from parcel to parcel. It also shows the contribution from sheds, particularly in this case, small unregulated sheds, and how multiple fuels came together. So let's take a look at this. So this is a case where we had shed ignite. The shed ignited the combustible fence. This combustible fence ignited the adjacent neighboring shed, which literally exploded, injuring a firefighter, and within seconds ignited this residence, which was destroyed. And I'll show you at the end of the presentation a slide about our structure separation distance shed to residence series of experiments that we're going to be talking about next year. So pathways, what types of fuels are involved? In these 5 cases, mulch and vegetation, detached combustible, so fence, wood pile, these are all important issues that we're looking at, but also structure to structure, commercial and residential, vehicles, which as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at in a couple of years, and then multiple hazards, shed to fence to shed to house, we just looked at that, car to shed to house, fence to boat to house, and then the one we looked at with the fence to the tree. So you see the different pathways, and it's very important to understand that we have to uncouple both. We have to understand the ember contribution and the fire contribution, because we don't want the flames to bridge those gaps and get fire to the house. So implementation ideas to consider. Considers spotting and ignition potential in and around town. And that's going to really impact as we look forward, not only the response, but in terms of defensive actions, but also the evacuation. Consider structure survivability in the absence of defensive actions. I think there's a big difference between designing a building and acknowledging that we're creating defensible space to allow first responders to be there and put that fire out and save that building, versus acknowledging that we are now in a regime where we might have firestorms, not enough first responders, many buildings will have to stand alone and therefore have to be designed for that purpose. So there could be a need for a paradigm shift, or at least a discussion by the decision makers on where to set the bar. Consider parcel level hazard reduction and parcel to parcel propagation. And this is a very important issue, as we're going to see going forward, because the fire doesn't care about the ownership of the parcel. Your neighbor's shed will burn your house down under the right conditions. So we have to think, even though the codes are parcel centric, we have to think about exposures and feed that into the codes and make the appropriate adjustments in terms of setbacks to make sure we have the necessary protection between parcels. So let's talk about primary driving factors, and I'm going to wrap it up. So ignition potential, fuel density, wind, terrain, and extended fire front. Two things here I want to point out. We're going to talk about extended fire front. This is a nuanced, something that is potentially different. The main point I want to make here on this slide is that bullet 2, density of vegetative and structural fuels, is the only thing we have control over, right? We cannot control the fuel ignition potential. We cannot control drought. We cannot control wind. We cannot control terrain, and we cannot control where the ignition is going to occur ultimately. So it's all about the exposure knob that we can control by the density of vegetative and structural fuels, and then adjusting the structure hardening knob to make sure that we end up with a surviving structure, with or without defensive actions, depending on where you want to set the bar. So it was the confluence of all of these 4 factors here that resulted in this super aggressive fire behavior that we saw at the campfire. Fuel ignition potential, I briefly talked about this, and we talked about the number of spots. This was a really big issue because they couldn't get ahead of it. Once the embers started reaching the community, there was no way out in terms of putting it out. And then, unfortunately, this is going to be the situation in many other communities. Density of vegetative and structural fuels, that's where we want to be working. In this case, we had century-long community growth, no fire history for a century. In some cases, because of the organic growth of Paradise, a lot of small lots, dense construction. And the last thing I want to mention here is we need to be mindful. This was brought to us by Technical Discussion 008 of post-fire fuel transition to brush and fine fuels, which we saw in Concau, and we're going to probably see in Paradise as well because of the removal of this 150,000 trees. So the landscape is literally going to change. We need to understand that and adapt our response to that. So in terms of density of vegetative and structural fuels, a couple of things to point out here when we talk about exposure. 2 very different ideas. One is remove the fuel and the other is displace. So remove fuel is something that we're going to have to start thinking about, particularly in high density, because there's no room to put them. We saw this going all the way back to the witch fire, where we tell people to displace fuels. They put the fuels on the edge of the property, and now we create this high fuel corridors, fences with wood piles on both sides through the community that carry fire from parcel to parcel. So big difference. We need to be mindful of where we want to displace when we remove. And that's really going to be primarily a function of the fuel density, i.e. structure density. Hardened structures, I think materials will help us in the future. Community design will help us. Fire resistant design will help us. Ultimately, some active systems, I think, can add value, but I think this is really it's early days, and we don't want to be in a situation where one active system is taking away critical water resources from other parts of the community and disabling, limiting the options of first responders. So the active systems need to be thought carefully when we're talking about water. Active systems in context of shutters and things like that can add also a value as the test methods for their evaluation mature. So we talked about structure ignition pathways, and we are looking at different parts of this puzzle with our research. And I want to talk now specifically about ornamental vegetation. We said at the very beginning of the presentation that Paradise was well prepared, and they had done treatments. So let's talk about a couple of treatments. Specific here, the Paradise irrigation, the pump house, very effective in the context it enabled first responders to be there and save the pump house. And that worked very well. Fuel treatments can reduce exposures, and we know that, but they have to be maintained, as you know. This is a second example of a successful fuel treatment on critical infrastructure. In this case, a school in Magalia, which survived very well. The fuel treatment changed the fire behavior, dramatically dropped the intensity, enabled first responders to use the safety zone and also save the infrastructure. I skipped wind and terrain. We talked about that, and with that video, I don't want to disrupt the presentation. The last thing here I want to point out, and this may be a little counterintuitive to some, is the extent and size of fire front reaching the community in the context of the location of the ignition, near versus far from the community. So this is this is figure 57 in the report. We have this idealized situation. This is a community. In this case, you can think of this as Paradise. And on the upper part of the figure here, we have an ignition that's close. And many people may think that this is really a very bad situation. It is locally, but macroscopically from big picture is not. That's actually a better situation, because if the ignition is close, the fire front is going to be very small. The large ampere exposure area is going to be quite contained, and the low ampere flux area will represent only a small fraction of the community, increasing the likelihood of containment. As we take that ignition far, many people may think that, yeah, that buys us more time, and it does, but depending on the conditions, if it's upwind and the fuel is right and the topography is right and the wind is right, it might not buy you that much more time, but what it does is it now creates a very large fire front, which is what happened to Paradise. In Paradise, almost the entire eastern edge of the community got hit within minutes with that long fire front, which then moved and caused extensive destruction. And here, the embers are reaching across the entire community, as we saw. So we want to be thinking about this in the context of evacuation and trigger points. So let's go through the summary, and then I have one more idea I want to share with you, and then we'll wrap it up. So implementation: identify areas where local high winds may cause extreme fire behavior, and think how this is going to play out in context of evacuation. Fuel reductions for infrastructure, but also for parcels. These are all things I know you think about all the time. Far field ignitions, I think, are something to really think about, because we are seeing those in not just one spot, it's multiple spots over miles, and those really change how we think and respond to these events, and specifically in the context of evacuation trigger points. The last point I want to make before we wrap it up here is item number 5, question number 5. We started with, how many other communities are there? In talking with first responders, we would always get different lists, and because people were thinking of different parts of this problem. So what we found is that we're missing a community-wide fire hazard framework to tie this problem together at a community scale and help us look at it macroscopically. You can think of this essentially as a tool that can go into your CWPPs as an example. The tool can be used by a community, can be used at the county level, it can be used at the state level, and I'm hoping at some point to have this tool used at the national level to help identify communities that have significant life safety issues as priority number 1, and then look at losses, infrastructure, and help us understand where we want to effectively use mitigation dollars, mitigation resources at the county, state, and national level. So this tool gives us a couple of, it has multiple purposes. A lot of it's slim, it's quite thin, but we have really spent a very significant amount of time trying to put in there the minimum amount of high impact information so that it can be more readily usable. by communities. And most of the data is going to be available by that goes in here at the community level, but not necessarily in one spot. And there is the value. We want to be able to pull all of that information together so that we can analyze it and look at all these different layers and how they interact. So we can look at arteries, and we can look at fire history, and we can look at potential burnover areas as an example. So this information can be used pre-fire to understand what's going on in the community, but also some of this information collected can be passed on. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that some of the information, specifically in context of hazardous locations, should be passed on to mutual aid. This tool, this framework would allow you to take that layer and pass it on to incoming resources, enhancing their response and increasing their life safety as well. So, as an example, in Paradise, there was a large propane depot. That type of information we want to make sure we can carry and pass on. So this is a standardized, comprehensive community pre-fire hazard documentation framework. And we look at community details, demographics, fuels, fire history, weather. And again, it's very easy to add more. We have spent a lot of time trying to keep it as concise as possible. I also want to mention that this is our Appendix C, as in Charlie. This framework is currently in the Chapter 49 in Appendix P, as in Paul. So it is voluntary, and we really encourage you to take a look at it. As I mentioned earlier, most of this information is available to you, or should be available to you, and you can just pull it together and start querying it in different ways. We think it's going to be a powerful tool, and we have gotten some good feedback so far on this from different stakeholders. To wrap it up, I'm not going to go through all the recommendations, and I'm not going to go through all the technical findings. You can find all of that in the report. The two things I want to mention: number one, we really need to stay on top of burnovers. We're planning to invest in understanding those burnovers going forward, help us understand how we can mitigate them by fuel removal, how we can identify those conditions, and what other options we may have, particularly in the context of report number 4 coming out, on how to tie this together in the context of evacuation and trigger points. The second part, parcel level exposures. We really need to understand those exposures and quantify them, not only at the parcel level, but parcel to parcel. This is all going to be very important, and it's going to feed into the state codes in many cases through Chapter 49 and defensible space, but also a lot of that information you will be able to, of course, pick up and in many cases make more restrictive as you frequently do at the local level. So I want to thank all of our technical contributors and all of our team that has made this report possible. 151 technical discussions, over 190 participants in this case study to date. So a big thank you to all. And I'm going to leave this up here for a second in case you want to pick up this QR code again. This is for our campfire. And then I have one last slide on the structure separation. And then we'll call it done and take questions. So let me move to the next slide, and then I can always come back and leave this up during questions. So we talk about structure separation experiments. We're currently doing phase 1 work, which is shed to structure. This is an effort that has been really spearheaded with funding from CAL FIRE, so big thank you. And it's a multi-agency collaboration. I didn't put all the logos on this. It'd be a little too crowded, but I encourage you to go to our website here, and you see all of our collaborators, of course, CAL FIRE, IBHS, U.S. Forest Service, California Building Industry Association, FEMA, and U.S. Fire Administration. So a big team, and we're looking at shed to house for this first phase. And here, just as a little example, we see a steel shed causing an ignition to a Chapter 7A compliant structure at 5 feet away. And then when we move it out at 10 feet, it doesn't cause the ignition. Here we have just a little snapshot of our double wide wind machine we just got in the last month. And we're using right now, literally as we speak, we did a burn this morning to conduct some of these experiments outdoors with wind. So we're going to be able to report, do a preliminary report for you early next year, and then a more detailed report, second report on this next spring. So with that, I'm going to say a big thank you again for the invite and turn it over to Denise and any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Alexander. This report, it took you almost 2 years to produce. Is that right?
That is correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very, very, very thorough. And we're going to, with your permission, post the report in its entirety on our website, if you're okay with
Absolutely.
that. Okay,
Yes,
okay,
absolutely.
all right, because we'd love to be able to watch the videos and you have a lot of great content. Now, I think for our group, understanding that the start of the campfire traveled 7 miles in 90 minutes.
Yes. Yes.
So if you put that in context for San Mateo County, we had our own wildfire last year called the CZU fire. And the eastern perimeter of that fire came about 7 miles away from the perimeter of a town called Portola Valley and Woodside. And so most of the people here on that call can visualize that. And so 90 minutes, I mean, that's unprecedented. It just blows the mind how fast.
And Denise, I want to mention something here because many people appreciate that there was a wind event, but maybe not everyone appreciates that the ignition occurred at the tail end of the wind event. Yeah. So if you look at the weather data, you know, we really had peak winds between 3:30 and 6:30, and the ignition occurred at the very tail end of that. The second point that I think is very important and literally keeps us up at night is the acknowledgement that we're very fortunate that the ignition occurred at 6:30. Had the ignition occurred at 3:30, not only the progression would have been different, it would have hit Paradise when everyone was sleeping.
Good point. Yeah.
So this is really, it was a horrible event from a life safety perspective. You know, unfortunately, we raised the bar to 85, but I don't want us to think that that's the worst case scenario, unfortunately, right? We were fortunate that it developed the way it did, if we can say such a thing. It is obviously terrible that 85 people lost their lives, but had that ignition occurred earlier, it would have been a very different story. And we know this because we saw even that short time between when it hit Concow and when it hit Paradise, very different in how the public was taken aback. Very different behavior. So we have to really think that we may not be in a situation where, you know, everybody will be up and at work or up and out and about. We need to think that this could be a situation where it hits in the middle of the night.
Right. No, you're right. That is a worst case scenario, if you can imagine one. Okay, we'd like to open it up to some questions, and we can do that in a couple of different ways. You can type your question in the chat, or you can go to the little reactions icon, and you can actually raise your hand, and maybe Sheena can help let me know who has their hand raised, and we can ask some questions. I can start while people are populating their questions. So what you're saying is once the burning started in Paradise, the wind event was actually slowing down. And so do you know, was it the structural fuels that maintained the intensity and the rate of spread, or what was it in Paradise?
When we say the wind event was, between, and I'm giving rough numbers. You can look at the report in wind. But 3 to 30, we had significantly higher gusts and much higher sustained wind. It's not that at 6:30 it went to zero, because we have the report at 7:30, the picture, the video I showed on Rim Road, where softball size rocks are hitting the engine. So it's not that there was no wind, but it's not a case where it hit Paradise and for 6 hours after it hit, we had 60 miles an hour sustained throughout the community. That's not how the event developed. There were localized pockets of high wind, and that was a combination frequently of topography and local wind, and in some cases, fire induced because of the very rapid progression, up ravines and things like that. But once you get so many ignitions, even without wind, if you have so much fuel, it'll grow, and it doesn't take much to keep it moving.
Right. And so the wind that you said was that at the higher elevations? You mentioned topography, so it was a little windier at the higher elevations?
There's no question that it was a combination of elevation, but also the local conditions. If you were facing a topographical feature that was lined up with that prevailing wind from the east-northeast, then locally over there you would have a big hit. You could go, potentially a quarter mile one way or the other and have very significant differences, because we have people and we have video, and the video really tells the story. There are cases where you can clearly see that it's very windy, and there are other cases where it's almost still. So it really varied. And if you think of the community, as that wind goes in, all those fuels, the high density of the trees and the structures and all that's going to break that wind up, right? But the fire comes, brings its own, so that plus whatever remnant local wind enables it to propagate.
Okay, understood. So we have a question from Rusty Day. Rusty, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question, because it's a little bit complex.
Thank you very much, Alex. This is a wonderful presentation. Among the recommendations that you mentioned you're going to be working on, you listed development of technical guidance on parcel level and parcel-to-parcel level exposures. And I was wondering if you could explain a bit, please, what kinds of topics or considerations such a technical guidance would address. What is it that you're contemplating by that?
So I'm going to go back to this slide and use that as to start the discussion. So we have two exposure problems. We have fire and embers, and we need to address both. So we want to make sure that we understand where we need to harden for each. And that's the type of information that we're thinking about generating. That's the first layer, if you will. But it goes beyond that. What we want to do, and what we're doing with our work, is understand the spatial relationships of all those fuels, right? So we want to uncouple those pathways to the structure. We're going to say that in the WUI, you're going to have to harden for embers. There is no way around that. And the hardening for embers, as we're going to show in the report that Eric and I and CAL FIRE and IBHS are going to be putting together over the next 2 to 3 months, is unfortunately not something that can be done in an hour or two. To truly harden a building for embers is a significant undertaking. And the reason for that is there are many weak spots. And if you're in a low ember exposure environment, maybe you'll get lucky. And if you do half of them or 80% of them, your home won't ignite. But in these severe events, when we're talking about literally millions of embers hitting parcels, if you don't do your due diligence and truly harden for embers, you're going to lose the house. Or you won't lose it, it'll ignite and somebody will save it. But that's how it's going to go. So we need to harden for embers, and I think that's going to be the baseline. Beyond that, what we want to do is we want to understand those spatial relationships. And in my mind, I think of that in two separate categories: movable attributes and unmovable attributes. So as an example, on the page that we're showing here, the shed is a movable attribute. You can displace your small shed, move it away from your house, move it away from your neighbor's house. That's something you can do, so that if the shed catches on fire, whether it is the contents or the shed and the contents, the flames from that shed won't ignite your house. And by that, I don't mean only your residence. We want to make sure that if you have a deck, it doesn't ignite the deck, which then burns your house down. It doesn't ignite your fence, which then burns your house down, and so on and so forth. So that's the movable component. The non-movable is your neighboring structure, your neighbor's house. That, for existing construction, we're stuck. We cannot move those buildings. So in those situations, what we're doing, we have to raise the bar and say, we want that fire not to domino. We're going to have to be very strict and make sure that we don't get ignitions on those parcels. And this is really going to be a serious discussion for high density as we go forward. So, Rusty, to sum it up, it's a geospatial solution. If you think about it, we want to make sure we capture the ember component, but we also need to explicitly address the fire, because we don't want the fire to get to the house. And I'm thinking of, we talked about the two knobs for the exposure, fire and embers one side, hardening the other side. Think of the exposure knob in a very simplistic way. We can make it binary, right? We can say low ember exposure, high ember exposure, low fire exposure, high fire exposure. So the neighbor 6 feet away is high fire exposure, and that's going to be very difficult to stop. A small fuel, like a small cluster of vegetation, could generate a low fire exposure, which, hardened Chapter 7A construction may be able to withstand if we tweak some of the ember issues. But it's not all low fire exposures on the parcel. Wood piles, fences, railroad ties, retaining walls, cars, sheds, these all to be addressed to make sure that we don't have the progression. And also, the second thing, very important, I want to mention is the fire behaves non-linearly, meaning if you have a combustible fence and you have a combustible shed and you put them side by side, the result is not the energy you would get from the simple fence and the simple shed. The agglomeration or the increase in density of the fuels results, I'm going to use the term loosely, exponential, a very rapid increase in the energy release, which increases the hazard, which then requires different spacing. So you cannot just say fence 15 feet away, shed 15 feet away, shed and fence can be next to each other, we're fine, because shed and fence at 15 feet away is not going to be enough. You need to go to 20 or 25. So those are the relationships we're going to really need to understand and capture as we go forward with this methodology, which is going to be fed by all this research that we're doing, like the structure to structure. Does that answer your question?
It did. The one, if I may just follow up, one point that you made in that description, which I think is extremely helpful and poignant to focus on, is I heard what you said is that you want to decouple the pathways for propagation and spread.
Absolutely.
I thought I think that's a very helpful and constructive way to think about how do we reduce hazard at a parcel and parcel to parcel and neighborhood. What do we have to do to decouple the pathways for propagation and spread? Thank you.
So I want to try to relate this back to our.
Can you repeat your last statement, please?
Oh, yeah, it's Denise, Alex. I have
Go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
want to try to figure out a way. So the picture that you had on Upper Skyway, when I saw that picture, it looked relatively flat, and it resembled to me one of our main arterial roads called Highway 35, which is in a higher elevation of our county. And I know that was a problem area for Paradise. And I'm wondering, is there, what kind of vegetation was there? It looks like there was a lot of conifers there.
There
Did
were
it have a lot of
of-
underbrush before? Yeah.
There were a lot of conifers, but it's more than that. There were also commercial structures.
Okay.
And
Right up
that's-
near the road.
Yes, there were a few parking lots, but there were a lot of structures. And to me, that all kind of comes together. The structure separation work is primarily geared at understanding the spacing, but ultimately what we want to understand is the exposures being generated by those different fuels, whether it's a shed, a car, an RV, an auxiliary dwelling unit, or a single residence, so that we can start getting a sense for how close we can be to that stuff, whether you're talking evacuation or you're talking sheltering near it or an egress artery and so on. So I think that is one of the challenges in Paradise, specifically, we're talking Skyway, but it was really an issue across the board, was the lack of fire history. There was just so much fuel. And I want to convey this idea to you by saying the following. We have at least 2 confirmed locations where fire burned multiple times. One is by one of the fire stations where the fire front went through. The wind would drop enough needles that a second fire front would go through. And sometime later, more needles were laid down on the ground with enough fuel that a third fire front would go through.
Okay.
So the fire history, fuel loading, that's going to be very important. We need to understand this because that's ultimately what we're going to be able to control.
Right. So Pearson Road was the same situation. There was
Pearson was worse because of the Pearson. Let me go to Pearson real quick. Bear with me. It's there. Okay. Pearson Road was worse because there was snake in the. I mean, the road did. The road was not straight, and it went through a depression. So there was a ravine. So it went through a local topographical feature. And we believe that helped funnel the local conditions and exacerbate the local conditions.
okay. And so do you know like the temperatures that potentially were sustained? I mean, you said that the people were
So what I can tell you is that we don't have absolute temperature measurements. We don't have any thermocouple readings or anything like that. What we do know is vehicles ignited. We know that with everything else around them. This engine, the vents for the diesel tank blew. It got so hot that the diesel tank, the saddle tanks, the pressure relief vents popped. And then the side of the engines sustained significant heat damage. So it got very hot. It got very, very hot.
Right. Okay, yeah, I think we have probably a lot of roads like that that are windy, that go through depression.
Windy, that's the
Yeah.
term I was looking for. Yeah,
Yeah,
windy
windy.
road through
Yeah.
a ravine.
Right, right. Okay, let's see, we have here. You also mentioned in the steep canyons, you had some 100-foot flame lengths. Were those the conifers burning?
That's what we believe. That's what we believe. It wasn't only, but there was a predominance of conifers in that area, and we saw severe fire behavior in several locations. If you read over the Kudling burnover, which occurred, it's at the top of Paradise, between Paradise and Magalia, next to the Paradise Irrigation District. It's not clear to us why the fire made such a run. Nominally around midnight. We would like to try and resolve it, but I'm not convinced that we have the data, the weather resolution, to see if there was locally an increase in speed of the wind that fanned that spot, or if it was a result of the just the local fuel and topography. So we don't know if the wind contributed or not, but we ended up with flames shooting up that hill very rapidly, causing a big mess. So locally, very aggressive fire behavior up there, and that's just one example.
Right, right. Yeah, and this is going back 2 years. Of our 2 years back into our drought. So it was maybe less of a drought. Was there a lot of, you did mention some diseased material, some diseased vegetation?
The Paradise hadn't received water for over 200 days in form of precipitation. I think there was less than a quarter inch or something like that. That's in the report. But we had the drought, and there were 3 different, we're told by the Paradise Public Works that there were 3 different diseases in town with the conifers. So there was definitely an issue. But even without that, there was just so much fuel. I mean, to give you a sense of how much the just event. And despite that, we have reports of soccer ball size tumbleweed of pine needles on fire rolling through the community.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And this is the challenge with, and I'm 100%, we want to make sure people do their housekeeping and clean. But if you're in that environment with wind, you're not going to, you're going to end up with piles in every corner and valley of your roof ridge, by your house. It's going to be everywhere. Cleaning is definitely good, but that's not going to be what the fire actually sees when it gets to your house, if you have a wind event.
Right. Now, will any of your future reports, or does this report in any of the appendices, does it list out any building materials that were utilized on buildings that that survived?
We're going to be looking at structure response in report number 5, because we collected data on over 100 damaged structures. And we're going to be looking at the exposures that those damaged structures saw, because we went around and, did a 360 and documented what burned, the distance away. And we're going to try and stitch this together and look at the relationships. But what is very important here to acknowledge is that this is a very large event by any account. And we could not, like in our previous events, track down all the first responders. There were literally thousands over the first 48, 72 hours. We could not do that. So we will not have all the defensive actions that took place, unlike our previous reports. We have a number that we have hypothesized, some which we have confirmed. some of which we know, but we will not have all the defensive actions because just of the sheer magnitude of this event. But we have a lot of information to tie exposure and response. And that's, for us, the way we do these reconstructions, you cannot walk the incident back and say, this heat flux hit that wall and that wall cracked, or this flux hit that wall and the wall didn't crack. You cannot do that in a post-fire environment. Even though people attempt to make connections between the exposure and the response, the best thing you can do is, number one, understand if then you have to do completely different, because what you're seeing is the result of the defensive action. If you can confirm that it wasn't defended, then you can take that information with that inferred exposure, bring it back to the lab, reproduce it, understand it, document it, and then work on the mitigation if necessary. But you cannot go and say, oh, look, as an aggregate, Chapter 7A works here. And it didn't, that's not technically sound. I'm the first to say that Chapter 7A adds value. There's no question about that. But to go from a specific incident to the performance, you have to have extremely high resolution data to be able to make specific statements. Because even if you understand the local, even if you say, okay, I know that shed was a wooden shed, 8 feet by 8 feet, and it had 250 pounds of wood in it, in that form. Even if you had that type of resolution, on top of that, you would need to know at the very local level when the shed was burning, which way the wind was blowing.
Got it.
Because if that wind moved 50 degrees from your hypothesis, then the whole assessment interpretation is wrong. So that's the challenge. But for us, we don't see it as a negative. That's where we find those vulnerabilities, and then we go to the lab and then reconstruct them and then work towards the mitigation answers.
All right. Well, it's an amazing report. I mean, and the fact that you have different, you're adding on to it, with number 4 and 5 is just amazing. So we're gonna keep we want you to keep us posted, and we're looking forward to, I think it's January, we'll have you come back with the separation data.
Yes.
And we'll put
The
this
first
report,
round of separation data.
the first round, yeah, of course. But yeah, there's a lot of us that would like to see that, and I'm sure Chapter 7A would probably like to see that too, the committee.
Yes, yes.
Well, I can't thank you enough, Alexander, and Eric too. You guys are doing a great job. It's much needed research that you're doing, and we appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having us, and we look forward to our continued collaborations, and we'll come back in January with the first of many installments on the structural separation.
It sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.